So let's start the second dim sum lecture, which I always call dim sum lecture. It's a Chinese. Harry Sam is here. He is one of the major donors. Too bad Mr. Ting is not able to come. I asked him many times, but we are grateful for them to donate this money, which allow CMSA to run this important lecture, which we learn a lot. So this year we have Maskin, and I think it's very interesting things for mathematicians to learn what we can do in economics. So CMSA is a center which we established 5 years ago, and mathematics is the major discipline, but we reach out to many different areas, including physics, economics, biology, engineer, and many other subjects. So I'm very glad that we have these lectures going on, and so let's have Scott to chair this from economics.
It's a little bit terrifying to be coming between Yao and Eric Maskin, two absolute titans. But I'm very honored to introduce my colleague, mentor, and friend, Eric Maskin. Eric is a true titan of economic theory. He is responsible for the foundations of tons of different areas, ranging from all of our thinking about social choice and mechanism design to things in evolutionary games. Today, of course, he's going to tell us about how to improve presidential elections, the mathematics of voting. But let me tell you, one thing about him first. So Eric has many, many accolades. There are way more than we could actually list. We'd be here the entire duration of the talk. Some of them are like really fancy. At least one of them was in memory of Alfred Nobel. But the most extraordinary thing, I've always thought about him is the excitement he brings to everything he works on and everything he hears. And, here is my example of that. So one of the first times I ever met with Eric, just sort of like sat me down and said, "What have you been working on recently?" And I told him about some new economic theory paper I was writing. And we talked about it for about half an hour, and he asked all these really interesting questions and gave me all these new ideas. And then I said, after that, and meanwhile, what are you excited about? Sort of, thanks so much. This was really helpful. What are you excited about these days? And he said, well, actually, I'm always most excited about sort of the last thing I learned or thought about. So right now, it's your project that I'm most excited about. And then he went on to continue thinking about it. He asked me more questions and more ideas for the next couple of days. And this was extraordinary, right? I had just finished my PhD. I was a kid, and he's a titan. And there was nothing more exciting to him at that moment than what I had to think about. So I really appreciate that honor and all of the awesomeness Eric brings. And we're really, really excited to have him here today. Eric Maskin, How to Improve Presidential Elections, the Mathematics of Voting. Let's welcome him.
Well, thank you very much, Yao, Scott. It's a difficult introduction to live up to, but I will do what I can. And thanks to all of you for coming. So I'm going to talk about improving presidential elections. This is largely a theoretical talk, but let me start with something historical. Donald Trump is president. I hope that's not news to anyone. One question that is going to be asked about this for years is how this could have happened. And this question can be answered at many different levels. Historians, I'm sure, will have much to say about it 50 years from now. But I'm going to answer at a very superficial level, which is Trump became president because first he got the Republican nomination. He won primaries in 36 states. And then he defeated Hillary Clinton in the general election. But the puzzling thing about this history is that in the primaries, at least the first 17 primaries that he won, the anti-Trump vote was actually bigger than the pro-Trump vote. And there was a similar story in the general election. Florida, Michigan, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin were all states that Trump won. But actually, in all of those states, there were more people voting against Trump than for Trump. Now, this, of course, entails no contradiction, because after all, in the primaries, although Trump got less than 50% of the votes in each of his first 17 victories, he was facing multiple opponents. He was facing Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz, John Kasich, and so on. And so the anti-Trump vote was split among these more mainstream Republicans. And there's reason to believe that if he had been just facing a single opponent, one mainstream rival, he would have won. They would have won. He would have lost. And history might have been different. In fact, quite early in the 2016 primary season, there was a poll done by the Washington Post and ABC News, which indicated that both Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio would have easily defeated Trump if it had been a one-on-one matchup, if it had been Cruz against Trump or Rubio against Trump. But of course, in reality, they were both running, and they ended up splitting this anti-Trump vote. What about in the general election? Well, I mentioned all the states where Trump got less than a majority. In particular, in three critical states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, the difference between the Trump vote and the Clinton vote was actually smaller than the vote for Jill Stein. You may remember that Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate, was running in that election and got a sizable number of votes. All the evidence suggests that most of these Stein voters would have voted for Clinton had Stein not been on the ballots, in which case Clinton would have won those states and the election. So vote splitting between Clinton and Stein allowed Trump to win the general election, just as vote splitting in the primaries allowed Trump to get the nomination. Now, this is just one election, the 2016 election, but this same phenomenon, vote splitting, has happened many, many times in US presidential history. A particularly notorious example was the election of 2000, which was a very close election between George W. Bush and Al Gore. It came down to one state, the state of Florida. Whichever one of them won Florida would be presidents. Now, as it turned out, at least according to the vote counters in Florida, Bush got more votes. He got a ridiculously small number of votes more than Gore, 600 out of about 5 million votes cast. But nearly 100,000 voters in Florida voted for Ralph Nader. And there's every reason to believe, we have a variety of evidence to suggest that most of those voters would have voted for Gore had Nader not been running, in which case Gore would have not only won, but he would have won quite easily. So what do all these examples show? they show that there's something wrong with our system of voting. We have what's called a plurality rule, or first past the post election system in this country. And by the way, I'm talking mostly about presidential elections in this talk, but everything I say also holds for congressional elections, elections for Senate, elections for House, which are also conducted on a plurality rule basis. So in a plurality rule election, each voter votes for one candidate, and whichever candidate gets the most votes, even if that's short of a majority, wins. And as we've seen from the examples I've shown you, plurality rule is highly vulnerable to vote splitting. And by that I mean, if there are two or more candidates who are pretty similar, they split the vote, and that allows a very different sort of candidate, perhaps an extreme candidate, to win the election. And this very serious flaw with plurality rule leads us to ask, is there a better way to elect presidents? And you can be sure that I wouldn't have dragged you here today if the answer were no. And if all you want is the answer, you can leave now. But if you want to see the details, stick around. I'm going to argue, actually, there are many better ways of electing presidents, but I'm going to show you the best way. And there's a theorem, or several theorems to back that up. That's why this is a mathematics talk, not just a politics talk. But the first lesson we can draw from plurality rule is that giving voters the opportunity just to vote for one candidate isn't enough, because that doesn't provide enough information about their preferences. So going back to 2016, Rubio or Kasich might well have defeated Trump in the early primaries, but that information wasn't collected from voters. They had a voter who voted for Rubio had no way of saying, well, actually, I also like Kasich more than Trump. And a voter who voted for Kasich had no way of saying, well, actually, I also like Rubio more than Trump. Similarly, Clinton might well have beaten Trump in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin if Stein hadn't been on the ballot, but Stein voters had no opportunity to express their preference for Clinton. And same thing with Gore and Nader in the 2000 election. So the first step in improving the election system is to allow voters to rank candidates, to do more than just vote for a single candidate. So you might say, well, I like Rubio best, but if Rubio doesn't win, then I want Kasich and then Trump. Or if I'm a Trump supporter, I might put Trump first, and then Kasich, and then Rubio. Then the question to ask is, well, what do we do with these rankings? And here, I want to point to the work of the 18th century political thinker and mathematician, the Marquis de Condorcet, who proposed using majority rule, or what I will sometimes call true majority rule, because as you will see, the winner truly is the majority favorite. So under majority rule, voters rank the candidates, and then we elect the candidate who, according to these rankings, would beat each of the others in a head-to-head contest. So here's an example. Suppose that we're back in one of the Republican primaries, and there are three groups of voters. They're the Trump voters, the Rubio voters, and the Kasich voters. And the Trump voters put Kasich second and Rubio third, and similarly for the Rubio voters and the Kasich voters. For simplicity, I'm breaking it down into just three groups of voters, but the same principles apply with more. So under the current system, plurality rule, you see that Trump is going to be the winner. He has 40% of the vote, which is more than Rubio or Kasich. But actually, Kasich is the majority winner because these people prefer Kasich to Trump, and these people prefer Kasich to Trump, and that's 60%, 35 plus 25. So Kasich defeats Trump, and Kasich also defeats Rubio, because these people prefer Kasich to Rubio, and these people prefer Kasich to Rubio, and that's 65%. So Kasich is the majority winner very strongly, but he gets more than 60% in any matchup. He's the true majority winner. And notice the contrast this makes with the plurality winner, who is Trump. Now, I will argue in favor of majority rule, but once voters are submitting rankings, there are lots of other voting rules we could use, and why not use one of those? One alternative to majority rule is something called runoff voting. Runoff voting is used to elect presidents in many countries, not this one, but it's used in France, and it's used in Brazil, and it's used in Russia, and it's used in Romania, and a number of other countries. In runoff voting, runoff voting is usually conducted in two stages. In the first stage, the first round, voters vote for one candidate, and if someone gets a majority, that's the end. If no one gets a majority, the top two vote getters go on to a second round, and whoever wins in the second round is elected. Now, runoff voting could be done in one stage if voters submitted rankings. So here's an example. This is the same example that I just looked at a moment ago. What will happen under runoff voting? Well, no one gets a majority, so the top two vote getters go on to a second round. The top two vote getters are Trump and Rubio. So Kasich is eliminated. Now, what will happen in the second round? In the second round, Trump faces Rubio, and Rubio wins. So these people prefer Rubio to Trump, and these people prefer Rubio to Trump. So that's 60%, and so Rubio wins. And that's in contrast with majority rule, which I pointed out elects Kasich. So what's wrong with runoff voting, you might ask? Which is better, runoff voting or majority rule? Or perhaps there's some other voting rule which is better than either of them. How do we resolve questions like that? Well, the way that a voting theorist like me tries to resolve them is by first stepping back and asking, well, what do we want out of a voting system in the first place? What are the axioms or the principles that any good voting rule should satisfy? And then we can try to see which voting rule or voting rules do the best job of satisfying those axioms. And that's the approach that I'm going to take today. Now, because this is a mathematical audience, or at least some of it is, I'm going to be a little bit formal for a moment, but if you don't like formalities, don't worry. I'm not going to dwell on them for very long. But let me just set up the framework. Let's suppose that there's a set of candidates, a set X of candidates, and once we have candidates, we can talk about all of the possible rankings of those candidates. So So curly Rx is the set of possible rankings. So that means that if there are 2 candidates, there are 2 possible rankings. If there are 3 candidates, there are 6 possible rankings, and so on. And for any particular ranking, let me use the notation XRY to mean X is ranked above Y for that ranking. Now, I'm going to suppose that there's actually a continuum of voters, a very large number of voters. And the reason for doing that will be clear in a minute. So we can describe the electorates by their rankings. So for each voter in the unit interval, the continuum between 0 to 1, for each voter I, Ri is that voter's ranking. And so once we've specified the ranking for each voter, we know we know the relevant characteristics of the electorate. We'll call that a profile. And what is a voting rule? A voting rule is just a function which determines the winning candidates on the basis of profiles, on the basis of voters' rankings. So for each profile, F of that profile is the winning candidates. So for example, I started by talking about plurality rule. Now, once we have a continuum of voters, we can't actually count up votes anymore. We have to talk about proportions of voters. So plurality rule is the voting rule which chooses candidate X as the winner if the proportion of voters who put X first, that is X above any other Y, is bigger than the proportion of voters who put any other candidate first, any other candidate X prime first. So that's the formal definition of a voting rule. For mathematicians, mu here is a measure, but I'll just refer to it as a proportion. Now, actually, what I've just said isn't quite right, because we could have a tie. We could have exactly as many voters ranking X first as ranking X prime first. But that's where the continuum comes in. If there are a lot of voters, if there are millions of voters, the chance of an exact tie is minuscule. And in fact, with a continuum of voters, the probability of an exact tie is 0 for plurality rule. So to be accurate, we're simply going to require that the voting rule give us a clear-cut winner for a generic profile. Not for every profile, but for generic profiles. Okay, so that's what a voting rule is. And as I said, my approach is going to be axiomatic. I'm going to look at principles we would want a good voting rule to satisfy. And all of the principles I'll be talking about here are completely standard in the voting literature. The first is what you might call the consensus principle. Economists call it the Pareto principle for reasons I won't get into. Economists like funny names. The consensus principle says that if everybody ranks X above Y, then Y won't be elected. Or to put it, this is the formal way of expressing what I just said in English. It's pretty hard to quarrel with that. It would be a very perverse voting system indeed that would elect Y even if everybody preferred X. And not surprisingly, it's satisfied by both majority rule and runoff voting. The second principle is also pretty pretty intuitive, pretty hard to quarrel with. It's what we might call the equal treatment principle or the anonymity principle, which says that all voters should count equally. It doesn't matter who you are, it just matters what your vote is. And the way that this is expressed formally is to start with a profile and now to permute which voter has which ranking. So we give I's ranking to J, and we give J's ranking to K, and so on. In the end, we have the same distribution of rankings, so we should have the same winner as before. Permuting the rankings shouldn't change the outcome. That's the anonymity principle. It happens to be violated by the Electoral College because the Electoral College is not anonymous in the sense that it matters very much which state you're in. But let me not get into that today. This is not a talk about the Electoral College. But the principle is satisfied by majority rule and runoff voting. Then there's the what we could call the neutrality, what is called the neutrality principle, which says that all candidates should be treated equally. And the way that we do that is to permute the candidates. We'll relabel candidate X, candidate Y, and we'll relabel Y, Z, and so on. If we permute, if we change voters' rankings in the same way that we change the names of the candidates, so if before X is above Y, now Y is above Z for that voter, then we should have the same outcome as before, except for the permutation. So if X won before, now Y should win, because we've relabeled X as Y. And so far, our voting rules, both majority rule and runoff voting, satisfy that too. So let's come to a voting rule axiom which distinguishes between true majority rule and runoff voting, and that's the no vote splitting principle. That was the thing that I started with. That's the flaw in plurality rule, the fact that it allows for vote splitting. The technical name for the no vote splitting principle is that it is called independence of irrelevant candidates or independence of irrelevant alternatives. And it gets at the idea that in a contest between X and Y, it shouldn't matter whether candidate Z, Jill Stein or Ralph Nader, is running or not. You should get the same outcome whether Z is on the ballot or not, if Z is not going to win anyway. And this is the formal way of expressing that. If X wins when we start with a candidate set capital X, if we knock candidate Z out off the ballot, we should still get the same winner. Yes, yes. We don't worry about Z anymore because Z isn't running. So wherever Z appeared in the ranking, Z is now deleted. Now it's easy to see that majority rule satisfies this no vote splitting, this independence condition, because if X is the winner when X, Y, and Z are running, that means that a majority of voters prefer X to Y, and a majority of voters also prefer X to Z. So if Z drops out, X still beats Y by majority. So majority rule is not affected by the possibility of vote splitting. But runoff voting is. So here's the same example that I've been using once again. A few minutes ago, I showed you that under runoff voting, Rubio wins, because first Kasich is knocked out, and then in the battle between Trump and Rubio, Rubio gets a majority. But that depends on the fact that Trump is running in the first place. If Trump doesn't run in the first place, then it's a battle between Kasich and Rubio, which Kasich wins, because these people prefer Kasich to Rubio, and these people prefer Kasich to Rubio, and that's 65%. So runoff voting violates the no vote splitting principle, and now majority rule moves ahead. Unfortunately, majority rule itself has a shortcoming, and probably many of you here know that. It was actually pointed out by Condorcet himself. He was a strong proponent of majority rule, but he realized that majority rule has a flaw, and that flaw is that there may not always be a candidate who beats all the others. And here's an example of that. So this is the first time I'm using a different example. So once again, there are three groups of voters, and they fall into three approximately equal groups, equal-sized groups. Notice that in a matchup between Rubio and Kasich, Rubio wins. These people prefer Rubio to Kasich. These people prefer Rubio to Kasich, so that's 68%. So Kasich can't be the majority winner. But Rubio can't be the majority winner because Trump beats Rubio. These people prefer Trump to Rubio. These people prefer Trump to Rubio. That's 67%. But Trump can't be the majority winner because Kasich beats Trump. These people prefer Kasich to Trump, and so do these. That's 65%. So that's a problem. This is called a Condorcet cycle, where we basically go around in circles. Rubio beats Kasich, Trump beats Rubio, Kasich beats Trump. And it illustrates that majority rule satisfies another axiom, it violates another axiom called decisiveness. Majority rule fails to be decisive because decisiveness requires that a winner should always exist, at least generically. And we can change these proportions a bit, and there'll still be no majority winner. So majority rule violates decisiveness. So here we are. Majority rule satisfies 4 axioms. Runoff voting satisfies 4 axioms, not the same ones. So it's not clear which of them is better. A natural question to ask at this point, is there any voting rule that satisfies all 5? That would be wonderful. That would be a clear improvement. But that's where the Arrow impossibility theorem comes in. Kenneth Arrow showed, how many years ago was it? 68 years ago, that there is no voting method that satisfies all these principles, which is too bad. But there's a sense in which Arrow's theorem is too negative, because Arrow required that a voting rule should satisfy all 5 principles, no matter what voters' rankings turn out to be. And in principle, that sounds fine, but in practice, some rankings may be very unlikely, so we're not going to worry about them too much. For example, going back to the Republican primaries of 2016, it was pretty clear that most Republicans either loved Trump or they hated him. There was no in-between view. Among his supporters, he was better than all of the other Republican candidates. Among his detractors, almost anyone was better than Trump. So that meant that if there were three candidates, Kasich, Rubio, and Trump, we might have Trump first, or Rubio or Kasich first and Trump last, but we wouldn't get rankings where Trump came out in the middle. We wouldn't get many of these. So the Republican Party was polarized between the Trump supporters and the Trump haters. That may have been not so good for the Republican Party, but it turns out to be very good for majority rule. Because if we can rule out these rankings where Trump comes in the middle, then the sort of example I showed you a couple minutes ago can't occur. We cannot get a Condorcet cycle. And so majority rule will satisfy all 5 axioms if we can rule out those Condorcet cycles. So that suggests that what we ought to do is not worry about voting rules satisfying all 5 axioms all the time, but we'll define a voting rule to work well for some restricted class of rankings if it satisfies the 5 principles when voters' rankings fall into that restricted class. So here is the formal statement. It works well, F works well for this restricted class, curly R, if it satisfies the 5 principles whenever profiles are drawn from this class. And now, and for example, majority rule works well if, for example, ranking, the restricted class consists of polarized rankings. Now, of course, any voting rule is going to work well if you restrict the class strongly enough. So what we're interested in is how broad a class of rankings a voting rule works well on. And for that, we get a domination theorem. This is something I developed with my friend and colleague, Partha Dasgupta. And it says informally that if you take some voting rule, which happens to work well for some particular class of rankings, then majority rule must also work well for that same class. And furthermore, there will exist some other class of rankings where majority rule works well, and the voting rule that we started with does not. So that's the sense in which majority rule dominates any other voting rule. Here it is. Here's the. If we're talking about 3 candidates, polarized rankings will be ones where one of those candidates cannot be in the middle. So we're limited to the 4 where, say, Trump is not in the middle. But it could be Kasich. It doesn't matter which one of them is not in the middle, as long as there's one who's not in the middle. So here's the formal statement of the theorem that I just stated. So if voting rule F works well for a particular class of rankings, curly R, then majority rule also works well for that class. And if the voting rule that we started with, F, is not itself majority rule, if it differs from majority rule for some open set of profiles, then there must exist another class of rankings where majority rule works well and F doesn't. So that's a formal statement of the domination theorem, and that leads us to conclude that there's a precise sense in which majority rule works well more often than any other method. In other words, there's a precise sense in which majority rule really is the best voting method. Now, of course, true majority rule is not always decisive. There may not be a majority winner, and what do we do then? Well, we have to have some tiebreaker. And there's actually a large literature on what is the right tiebreaker to use. For example, you could use runoff voting if you wanted, if there happens to be no majority winner. Runoff voting is decisive. But which tiebreaker we use actually doesn't affect the domination theorem at all. It's independent of the tiebreaker. And furthermore, and now I'm making an empirical statement, in practice, we never get Condorcet cycles. And we know this because Australia, for example, has had voters rank candidates now for 100 years. They have voters rank candidates to elect their lower house of parliament. And so we have 100 years of data on voters' rankings, no Condorcet cycle. So we have to say what happens if there is a Condorcet cycle, but in practice, it's not a real concern. Now, there are other axioms that we might want a voting rule to satisfy. And let me just mention one more, which is what we might call the strategy proof principle. We don't want voters to have the incentive to vote strategically, by which I mean they're submitting false rankings. Now, we go back to this example I've been using. Under plurality rule, we saw that Trump wins. But if if the Rubio and Kasich voters think about it, they realize that at least one of their groups should not vote honestly. At least one should vote strategically. For example, if the Kasich voters decided to put Rubio first, then Rubio would beat Trump. And Kasich voters prefer Rubio to Trump. And so they have a strong incentive in this example to vote strategically. So plurality rule is clearly vulnerable to strategic voting, and strategic voting in practice often plays a big role in plurality rule elections. What's wrong with that? Well, there's several things wrong. One thing that's wrong is that under strategic voting, we're distorting the inputs into the voting rule. Even if a voting rule satisfies all sorts of lovely axioms, if the inputs are getting distorted, then the outputs are going to get distorted, and there's no reason to think that the distorted outputs will also satisfy those attractive axioms. But there's an even more compelling reason. I think it's a more compelling reason to try to avoid strategic voting, and that is that it's hard on voters themselves. If I'm a good citizen, it's hard work for me to work out my own ranking. I have to research the candidates, understand where they stand on the issues, understand their character, their history, and so on. That's a considerable investment. But if the voting rule is vulnerable to strategic voting, I have to do more than that. I have to try to figure out how other people are going to vote so I can counteract what they're doing. And that's an order of magnitude, at least an order of magnitude harder on voters. And so strategic voting is a very bad thing for voters themselves. By the way, this is the formal definition of what a voting rule that is not vulnerable to strategic voting is. It just says that there shouldn't be any group of voters who all gain by misrepresenting their preferences. That's, they might actually each report different rankings, but there's going to be some coordination among that group, which all gets them a better outcome than what would happen if they reported their preferences truthfully. So what do we do about strategic voting? Well, here is the counterpart of the domination theorem. When we add this no strategic voting requirement, if a voting rule works well and it satisfies strategy proofness for some domain of preferences, then it has to be majority rule. And furthermore, majority rule satisfies strategy proofness whenever, on any domain for which it works well. So we get strategy proofness for free. If we're talking about a domain where majority rule works well, it also satisfies strategy proofness. Now this is, my talk today has been a theoretical talk. How can we improve on the current voting method? What is the best voting method? But a reasonable question to ask is, could we realistically expect the US to use majority rule, if not for presidential elections, at least for Senate and House elections? And I'm happy to say that I think that the answer is actually yes. And the reason I say that is because of the state of Maine. You may have heard that as of the election next month, the state of Maine is going to be having voters rank candidates for House and Senate. This is a first in the United States. And one nice thing about the American system of vote, there are many bad things about voting here, but one good thing is that every state can decide for itself how to vote. We don't need a federal law. We don't need a change in the Constitution. It's up to each state whether to use plurality rule or majority rule or something else. Now, Maine did not adopt majority rule. They adopted something which is called ranked choice voting, which is pretty similar to majority rule. Majority rule is actually still better, according to the theorem, but it's definitely a step in the right direction. And Massachusetts may be next. In fact, I'm on the advisory board of a group here in Massachusetts called Voter Choice Massachusetts, which wants to put ranked choice voting on the ballot. It'll be a ballot initiative in the 2020 election in Massachusetts. I believe that Scott Colgren from Voter Choice Massachusetts is here. If you would like to sign up with Scott in support of ranked choice voting in Massachusetts, please do so. But I wanted to end on this note of optimism. There are actually several other states in addition to Massachusetts, who are considering doing the same thing. We're moving in the right direction. Thanks very much.
So I think we get, speaking of axioms, we get excited when a math talk is mesmerizing, or when it presents conceptually elegant ideas, or when it presents, any way forward for American politics. Really awesome to have all three. Questions for Eric? Bill.
Thank you very much, Eric. It's fascinating. I have one question and one suggestion. You mentioned that Arrow's theorem said that there's no system satisfy all five.
Yep.
But you also said that when the majority fails, you can use the runoff. That will be a system, but that system itself cannot satisfy all five either, right?
Right.
So what's wrong with that system? Because that still will lead to some situation.
Okay, so
that's one question, but let me finish that suggestion.
Yeah.
Suggestion is that you also mentioned about, you never observe these Condorcet cycles, right? But mathematically, that's possible. Probably is there's a very small percentage of people do the middle part, but they did not affect any. Is there a probabilistic theorem saying that if the percentage of those people less than epsilon, then the probability of is bigger than 1 minus delta, something like that?
the answer to your second question is yes. Of course, ruling out any ranking with 100% probability, that's out of the question. There'll always be crazy voters who have crazy rankings, but as long as they're limited, then we can avoid Condorcet cycles. Now, you asked what goes wrong if we use a tiebreaker. Well, suppose we use runoff voting as the tiebreaker. I said that with majority rule, you satisfy strategy proofness as long as you're restricted, as long as voters' rankings are restricted to a class where the voting rule works well. But suppose that we're not restricted to that class, then we can have Condorcet cycles. And once we can have Condorcet cycles, strategic behavior on the part of voters becomes possible. So if we know that voters are not in this Condorcet cycle situation, we're fine. But if we use if we use any tiebreaker whatsoever, we're going to run into trouble with Condorcet cycles.
But the strategic principle was not the first five.
Same problem with. It's actually the no vote splitting principle, which is the hardest to satisfy. If there are Condorcet cycles, then the no vote splitting axiom is not going to be satisfied by any of these voting rules.
I have a question about the candidates themselves. I'm wondering how these different rules would impact the strategic thinking in terms of the candidates and whether or not they choose to run.
Good question. So there are two opposing forces in considering how candidates' incentives are affected. On the one hand, if you don't have to worry as a candidate that you're going to split the vote with other somewhat similar candidates, that may give you a much stronger incentive to run. Think back to the 2016 election. Bernie Sanders was defeated by Hillary Clinton in the Democratic primary, and he declined to vote to run as an independent in the general election. Why? because he knew that if he did run, Trump's election would be guaranteed, because he would split the vote with Clinton and Trump would have an easy victory. But under majority rule, he could have run as an independent. And so for candidates who are interested in increasing voters' options, moving to majority rule is going to encourage more people to run, particularly candidates in the center. So Michael Bloomberg also declined to run in the general election in 2016. Bloomberg was a sort of centrist candidate between Clinton and Trump. But he knew also that he would be splitting votes with Clinton, and he didn't want Trump to win. So he stayed out. But if under majority rule he might have run, and in fact he might even have won. He probably wouldn't have got a majority of first place votes, but he might well have fared well against Trump or Clinton in head-to-head battles. So for candidates who are running in order to increase voters' options, majority rule is a really good thing. Now, sometimes candidates want to run to try to change the platform of a dominant candidate. So that's why Ralph Nader was running in 2000. He wanted to change the Democratic platform, move it more to the left. He didn't really succeed in doing that. He succeeded in electing George Bush. But candidates who have that motivation are not going to like majority rule, because under majority rule, if you're Al Gore, you don't worry about Nader running, because some voters are going to rank Nader first and you second. A lot of voters are going to rank you first and Nader second, but you're not going to be splitting votes with Nader, and so you have no incentive to move to the left in that case. So that's why I say there are two forces in the opposite direction, depending on what your motivation for running is as a candidate. Yeah. So there have been studies on this. So there are some cities which have moved to giving voters the option of ranking candidates for mayor. San Francisco is now doing this. Minneapolis is doing this. A number of other cities have made this switch. And so we can actually study the before and after. And yes, giving voters more options and allowing them to express themselves more fully through ranking does improve turnout.
Right, and don't forget Cambridge City Council, right?
I should have said, Cambridge City Council has been using ranking longest of all. That goes way back.
So I have many questions for you. Here's one. I happen to have been teaching a social choice class during that primary. I did the following experiment with my students. At the time, the Republicans left weren't just Kasich and Rubio and Trump, but also Bush and, help me out here, first, I don't remember. There were a whole range of, and I had my class try to rank them. And you might guess there weren't a whole lot of Republicans in the class.
Not in
and their
Cambridge.
heads exploded when having to rank.
Yeah.
This is something that's always troubled. I mean, I love the impossibility theorems. They're very beautiful. But this is something that's always troubled me about this whole genre of theorem, the assumption that one's preferences are actually linearly ranked.
Okay. So you raise a very important point, and one that I was hoping would come up, because I didn't have a chance to get to this in the talk itself. Two things. First, if you have 16 candidates running, as were initially running in the Republican primary, insisting that voters rank 16 candidates is absurd. No voter is going to want to do that. And so it's very important when you're introducing any ranking system, like majority rule, that voters decide for themselves how many candidates to rank. That's what Maine for example, allows you to do. You don't have to rank all the candidates. You rank as many as you want. You can rank one if you want. You don't have, that is, you can do exactly what you do in plurality rule and just name your favorite candidate. The others will be treated as though they're tied for seconds. Now, I expressed all of these theorems for the case where voters actually do have strict rankings. They strictly prefer X to Y. But actually, everything I said holds equally well if there are ties in rankings. Well, I'm not sure I understand that. Only one candidate is going to get elected. So I'm not sure that contingencies matter. If you were talking about electing, if you were deciding how to fill a legislature, then you might worry about contingencies. I don't want X to be in the legislature unless Y is also there. But if there's a single winner, then contingencies don't come up. Now again, we have a lot of data from Australia, from cities like San Francisco and Minneapolis about how many candidates voters choose to rank. And it's not one. The voters want to do more than just name their favorite candidate. But it's not 16 either. Usually, most voters come out somewhere between 2 and 3. 4 is too many, but 1 is not enough. So the median comes out between 2 and 3.
So I was kind of curious, considering the fact that now you have to take in several factors such as specific ranking, doesn't it create the potential for more error when it comes to deciding selection, especially if it's a particularly close one?
More error. Well, these days, most votes are counted electronically. And if we can run an electronic banking system where my life savings depends on my bank getting it right, I don't see why we can't count votes in a pretty safe way too. It's just a matter of making the investments. The technology is certainly there. There's no reason why we can't use rank choice voting on a national scale. Now, you might say, if it's such a good idea, why didn't we do this from the beginning? In the beginning, it was simply impractical to count votes by hands if voters were going to be ranking candidates. Too much data for hand counters to digest, but there's no reason why machines can't do it.
Hey, the question is, you say it's a similar system. You just said is the difference between the majority rule and the ranked choice voting is the voter can rank as many as possible, as few as possible, not rank all of them. All right? Is that the only difference?
No, that's not in both, it's up to the voter to.
What's the difference?
Oh, so what's the difference between
rule and the ranked choice?
All right, so ranked choice voting it's sometimes called instant runoff voting, and here's how it works. Voters rank as many candidates as they want, and we look at their first choices. If there's a majority in favor of some candidate at the first place level, that candidate is elected. If there's no one who gets a majority, then we knock off the candidate who gets the fewest first place votes, and we iterate until somebody gets a majority. So that's ranked choice voting. It's not as good as true majority rule, but it's way better than plurality rule. Yeah, yeah.
Rank. Then you add up what the rank were. 1 and 2.
Yep. Right. That's actually a famous voting rule, which was proposed by Condorcet's arch rival, Jean-Charles Bourda. It's called the Bourda count, and probably many people have used the Bourda count for committee elections. The math department uses it to decide who the Benjamin Pierce lecturers are going to be. I think it's a big mistake for them to do that, but they do.
Well, now I'm convinced.
So the problem with that is that it violates the no vote splitting principle in a really big way. It's very vulnerable to vote split. It's also vulnerable to strategic manipulation.
Hi, thanks for the lecture. I was wondering if it's possible to make any sort of utilitarian statement in this regime where, for example, you could imagine it's costly, as was suggested in a previous question, for voters to distinguish their preferences when they start to become not completely indifferent, but close to indifferent, and that might allow you to leverage, you know, some sort of property to make a utilitarian statement like the highest valued candidate wins.
So I'm not quite sure. Are you saying why not allow voters to?
No, in the system you have, voters won't necessarily rank all N candidates.
That's right.
They will rank the candidates they feel strongly about, and then once their preferences start to become
That's right.
like more in.
I see what you're saying. Yes.
So now you could
That's
perhaps hope to get a utilitarian statement whereby the.
Yes, that's right. If declining to rank two candidates is saying that you don't really have strong feelings about them, then you're exactly right. You would want a voter who doesn't care very much whether X or Y to win not to matter very much in determining which of those two candidates wins. And if you decline to rank them, then you're doing exactly that. Yes, so we can't get full-blown utilitarianism out of a system like that. Full-blown utilitarianism where voters submit their utilities for candidates sounds great, but of course it's going to be highly vulnerable to strategic manipulation. If I like X a little bit more than Y, I have every incentive to say that I like X a lot better than Y to make sure that X wins rather than Y. But you can get close. You can get some approximation of that by declining to rank.
So, unfortunately, in the interest of time, I think I have to close us off there. But I think we can all agree that whether we use an ordinal mechanism or a cardinal mechanism, if forced to rank, we'd all put Eric at the top. So let's thank him again.